putting this event on this morning, and unfortunately Thomas Rainsborough can't be present. So we're here to commemorate his enormous contribution to the period of the English Civil War, but also to political thought and development surrounding the whole principle of what the Levellers stood for. Can we just take a vote? Are we all Levellers here today, yeah? Yes. Pick it up for the Levellers, okay? I want to call to speak is my old friend Brian Nicholson, executive member of the East London Historical Society, but I've known Brian for many, many years, both as a T&G representative of London Dockers, and as a good colleague on the executive of the London Labour Party for many years, and it's a real privilege to be able to invite Brian to speak to us today. Brian, where are you? Standing behind me
as ever. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. I know amongst you there are people more qualified in an historical sense to outline today's programme. My involvement in very early youth was to protect this park, which was then in them days the church graveyard. Just across the road was the old harbour master's house, and in 1958, some of you are too young to remember, when they imposed the first Rent Act, some of us chained ourselves to the gate out there so that they wouldn't take over this area for what they've got today. But alongside with other members of the Labour Party at the time, we thought that was the thing to do to protect our local community. And by the way, this historical society is a very big one in East London, and we tried to do exactly what Jeremy's about, with the help, and I've got to say this, whether you like it or not, with the help of our mayor. Our mayor saved Bancroft Road Library, its archive, for the people of East London, not just for the people on television and the people who want to get our kids to pay for their history and your history. And it makes me very angry when I see this thing going on. Trace your ancestry. £9 to get a piece of paper. That's where we're going. And if we're going to teach our kids anything, it's how to grow up responsible, respectful, and respect the community they live in. Thank you, Jeremy.
Next speaker is my good friend Baroness Paula Udin, who lives in this area, works at the other end of the building where I work at the present time. Very good friend of mine, and we work very well together for the Bangladeshi community and the Bangladesh group in Parliament. Paula, where are you? Right here, coming over. Here you are.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Tony Benn, Honourable Tony Benn, and thank you, Brian. Thank you, Rania. Thank you to everyone for allowing me to say a few words. This is a very important occasion for all of us in Tower Hamlet, but perhaps even the country, but specifically for people of Wapping, for being able to preserve and honour someone so important who talked about equality and justice and religious tolerance in 1600, you know, and that's just kind of incredible. I was really deeply touched when I heard about him, and I thank John and Carl and everybody here in allowing me to say a few words. Thank you very much for being allowed to be part of this historical occasion, and thank you for being here to honour who is an incredibly young socialist in his times, and I think he laid the bare stones for us all of us to follow community work and community activism. So thank you very much. Thank you, Rania.
John, for work with the Leveller Society, putting on today's event, and give him a good hearing. John.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. I just want to say a few words about Thomas Rainsborough, indeed the Rainsborough family, because the Rainsborough family are very closely associated with this area. They were seafarers from Wapping, when Wapping was a seafaring village. William Rainsborough, Thomas Rainsborough's father, helped establish the church, St John's Church here, when it was first set up in 1617. He himself is buried in this churchyard, was buried here in 1642, just 6 years before his more famous son Thomas was buried here. Thomas Rainsborough is probably best known for the part that he played in the Putney debates, when the levellers and the elected agitators of the new model army debated with the grandees, with the officers of the army, about what kind of society would emerge from the English Revolution. And perhaps some of the most famous words uttered during the entirety of the English Revolution were said by Thomas Rainsborough in those debates, and I just want to read them to you now. He said that the poorest he that is in England hath a life to live as the greatest he. I think it is clear that every man that is to live under a government ought first by his own consent to put himself under that government, and I do not think that the poorest man in England is not at all bound in a strict sense to that government that he hath not had a voice to put himself under. Now, those were revolutionary words in 1648, and he was detested by the Cavaliers and by the Royalists for his outspoken advocacy of democracy in the English Revolution, and he was killed as he was conducting one of the last sieges of the Second Civil War in Pontefract. He was in his lodgings in Doncaster when a Royalist raiding party broke into his room, dragged him into the street. He seized one of their swords. The Rainborough regiment today have it. It was ripped up by the mourners, and the sea green ribbon then became the symbol of the leveller movement from that moment on. So we're here to pay tribute to someone who was one of the first Democrats, who died in the cause of democracy, who was a great hero of the radicals of the English Revolution, who is buried here in this churchyard. Thank you very much.
Please to Councillor Rabina Khan, Councillor in Tower Hamlets, Cabinet Member, and she's done a great deal to ensure that this plaque happened. Apparently it was a chance conversation with John Rees that brought all this about. See what happens when you get a place like Firebox, when you have chance conversations. You never know where it might lead to. Rania, you're most welcome.
Thank you, Jeremy. First of all, it's anyone's worst nightmare to speak after John, because isn't he such a great speaker? He's one of my role models and a hero too. The idea has actually come from John. And so the patency right goes to him and no one else. And I want to thank him for this great idea and the thing that he's discovered. And Tony and Jeremy, who are also my personal favourite heroes. I love them both. And I also want to thank Councillor Lutfa Begum and Councillor Alibor Chowdhury, who is a neighbouring councillor in Shadwell, who have also supported this event. And also the council officers. They're the ones, a lot of work goes behind doing the plaque, the unveiling, etc., etc. A lot of work goes behind it, and the council officers, both within my portfolio, within my team, the culture team, and the comms team, have done a lot of work for this to happen tonight. So a round of applause for them as well, please. I've just written something. I've been doing a bit of research on Thomas Rainsborough, and I have to say I'm amazed by this man, and I think it's important to speak about him as much as we can, especially for the young people that are here and all the time, because we don't really read about him in history. I'm a science teacher myself, so I know that in history we're not taught about Thomas Rainsborough, and he was such a great man. So Rainsborough was an English revolutionary, a Republican and a leveller. Had he and the levellers succeeded the new model army, won the great struggle with the parliamentary side, then we would be talking about the English Revolution and not the French Revolution. Which, of course, the French Revolution came 150 years in any event anyway. Of course, if we had lived in France, we would probably be celebrating a national Rainsborough Day, and he would have been a national hero. But this is the conservative England that never grew up and discarded the monarchy, etc., etc. So this plaque is actually... Still time. Yeah, still time. So this plaque is actually a very small gesture to this great man. Look at what Rainsborough and the levellers were demanding, as Baroness Polo-Din also mentioned, in the 1640s, which were quite extraordinary, actually. A single chamber parliament elected annually. Manhood suffrage, except for servants and paupers. Constituencies delimited according to population. Segregation of the legislature and the executive. Freedom of worship and belief, as well as freedom of speech. Equality before the law. Abolition of capital punishment except for murder and treason. Abolition of imprisonment for debt, and free trade, freedom of person to refuse to answer incriminating question, as you see in the US Fifth Amendment too. And also he was a speaker, a women's, he spoke out against women's rights as well at that time in the 16th, for women's rights, sorry, at that time. Cromwell had some sympathy with the Levellers, but when elements of the New Model Army mutinied 8 months later after the execution of King Charles, he returned his forces against them, notably at the Salisbury and the Burford Church near Oxford, where every year a memorial meeting still takes place, I believe, to commemorate where 3 revellers were taken outside, court-martialed and shot against the church wall. And I know that Tony Benn, he often speaks at this event, and thank you for doing that. Today, the Rainborough name is a pseudonym used by a mystery left-wing journalist in Private Eye, and it's not me, Tribune and other publication. And here is a line that the Rainborough is best remembered for. For I really think that the poorest he that is in England had a life to live as the greatest he. Thomas Rainsborough at the Putney Debates, 1647. Thank you. Thank you for
an incredibly warm welcome to somebody who I think is a great hero of the Labour movement in this country and the much wider world, my good friend Tony Benn.
Comrades, it is a very great honour for me to be invited to come today, and I think it is a moment to think about our history, because when I look at the audience today, it's a small but representative group of local people, and all progress has been made throughout history by people just like ourselves who got together and decided that they wanted to make improvements, and that's how change occurred. Every generation fights the same battles for justice and peace and democracy and human rights, and we haven't completed that campaign yet, so we still have our work to do where we live. I often think of the Roman invasion of Britain, and of course when we were conquered by Rome, we became slaves of the Roman Empire. There were no rights at all, nobody had votes, there was no parliament, and over the years, as a result of the work done by Colonel Rainsborough and many others, we have succeeded in making huge changes which have benefited the people of this country. But we still have a monarchy which pretends that it governs us, and we go along with that pretense out of courtesy to the old lady, but it isn't really what it's about. It's a very old-fashioned idea that you have to have a monarch whom you worship and honour, when really we should be honouring ourselves and what we want and what we've achieved and what we should be doing ourselves. And this is an ongoing battle. It never ends, it never will end, but it has children yet to come. So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really honoured. Jeremy Corbyn is my favourite Member of Parliament, and I think he's an outstanding MP, and I've told him this before, so I'm not, he won't think I'm saying it just because I'm here today, and he represents the very best tradition of parliamentary democracy, which is what Rainborough fought for, and which we did to some extent succeed in achieving.
4, 3, 2, 1.
So if the regiment would like to come round, that would be fantastic. And the plaque says, Thomas Rainsborough was buried in this churchyard on the 14th of November 1648 after a funeral procession organised by the Leveller movement. Rainsborough was a spokesman for the Levellers and a colonel in the New Model Army. He was killed by a royalist raiding party during the siege of Pontefract. On the day of the funeral, a Leveller leaflet recorded the inscription on Rainsborough's tomb. It proclaimed that Rainsborough had made King, Lords, Commons, Judges shake, cities and committees quake. It was, he said, just, valiant and true, and it ended with the words that here Rainsborough bids the noble Levellers adieu.